Fantastic. Good afternoon and welcome back to all of you joining online and those in the room. My name is Annalisa Prizzon. I'm a researcher here at ODI. We are fast approaching the end of the conference, and over the past couple of days, we've tried to understand how finance ministers can best prioritize and allocate their resources to tackle a growing number of longer-term challenges at times when their own finances are under pressure, and also that service is increasingly becoming unaffordable for many countries or even no longer an option for others. So in this context, the exam question for this session is, can international finance help relax all the spending constraints, and if so, how? Well, I won't have the tough job of answering these questions, but before introducing the stellar panel I have here in the room and online, I would like to take advantage of my privilege as chair to share some reflections on our exam question. So one way to relax spending constraints is to boost the lending of multilateral development banks. I was lucky enough to support the members of the independent expert group on strengthening multilateral development banks mandated by the G20 presidency of India this year. I certainly know that MDBs are a very small part of the international finance landscape, but they have a unique combination of affordable finance, of technical assistance, research, convening power, and they can leverage their finances as banks. One of the co-conveners of the independent expert group on MDB reform is Professor Larry Summers. Many of you may remember him, many different roles, including a former US Treasury Secretary. All the time that we met throughout the past 6 months, he reminded us one important point: the world is on fire. And this is the reason why we need a big and urgent push on transformative investments to tackle the most pressing challenges of our times, and climate change is one of them. A world on fire needs multilateral development banks, and we need MDBs to triple their mandates, their instruments and finances. I'm not naive, this is hard, but a reform agenda that's tripling the finances of MDBs shouldn't be considered an ambitious agenda. It's what we need now to tackle, again, the most pressing challenges we've been discussing over the past couple of days. And again, we shouldn't forget that bigger banks should also be better and more effective banks. Just for your information, the report of the independent expert group on MDB reform will be released at the end of the World Bank IMF annual meetings, and it will set the vision for the future of MDBs, but most importantly, the roadmap to get there. So please do engage with it when it's going to be released soon. But in the meantime, and taking a much broader view on the role of international finance can play in relaxing the spending constraints for finance ministers, I'm delighted to introduce the stellar panel my colleagues at ODI have brought together this afternoon. Let me introduce online Sarah Jane Ahmed, the finance advisor of the V20 group of ministers of finance. I think, Sarah Jane, you're joining us from New York, am I correct?
I'm in Manila.
Thank you so much. I've been briefed kind of differently, so I would say thank you, Sarah, for staying up so late. It's really impressive. And just for your information, the vulnerable group, the V20, the Vulnerable 20 group of ministers of finance of the Climate Vulnerable Forum brings together 68 members. Am I correct, Sarah Jane?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. And I would like to bring to everyone's attention, I mean, Sarah Jane has played a key role in a number of initiatives, including the Sustainable Insurance Finance Facility at the V20. The international public finance system should reflect the priorities of the countries it's meant to support. We always forget about this, and they should be at the center stage to any discussion on the reform agenda of the IMF, multilateral development banks and bilateral funders. So we look forward later on to hearing from Sarah Jane about the changes V20 members would like to see in international financial institutions. On my left, Moussa Sow is a senior advisor to the Ministry of Finance in Senegal, is playing a pivotal role in setting up the Just Economic Transition Partnerships, JETIP, to support Senegal in the green transition. You might be aware this was announced at the Paris Summit, the new Global Finance Impact Summit in Paris in June. And I would like to reiterate, this is a clear example of how government leadership and international support can come together around a long-term vision for transformative change. If you haven't done so already and would like to learn more about the new generation of country platforms, I would encourage you to read a great analysis that my colleagues here at ODI have published. Stuart Hadley was the lead author. You can see some copies here in just outside the conference room, and I hope some of my colleagues can pop up the link in the chat. On my right, let me introduce you Kalpana Kosher. Kalpana is now the Director, Development Policy and Finance and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And many of you know her. She's covered a number of very senior positions at the IMF before. As many of you know by now, the past few years I've seen a growing push for reform of international financial institutions. I've just mentioned that, particularly the World Bank, to expand the operation, particularly to tackle global challenges. Climate change is one of them, and across countries, both low-income and middle-income countries. Concessional affordable finance plays a key role in enabling countries to build resilience and also to help them towards a low-carbon transition. But the most important point, it's a scarce resource. And a key challenge here is to scale up and maximize the impact of concessional finance. And Kalpana, we look forward to hearing more about the solution to these challenges. And here on my right, it's such a privilege to welcome Jeremy Zettelmeier, Director at Bruegel. Many of you know very well his seminal work, remarkable analysis and proposals on debt restructuring and debt relief. And also my PhD work nearly 2 decades ago was inspired by Jeremy's work. We are all aware that debt vulnerabilities in many countries are rising significantly, and that servicing debt is becoming more and more difficult at the expense of priority government spending. So we're very much look forward to hearing from Jeremy what can be done in the context of rising vulnerabilities that are more complex creditor structure. So without any further ado now, Sarah-Jane, my question to you is, what would V20 members like to see change in the way international financing institutions serve them? Sarah-Jane, over to you.
Thank you for the question. It just started raining, so I hope my internet doesn't get disrupted. So I prepared some slides just to answer this question, to share the perspectives coming from the V20 in terms of their expectations. So if we go to the next slide. And the next one. So the V20 ministers, as you rightly pointed out, now represent 68 countries and 1.74 billion people. It's clear that the global financial system is ill-equipped to deal with the climate crisis, and data shows that it's disproportionately impacting climate vulnerable countries, having lost more than $500 billion over the last 2 decades. So the V20 nations face a double burden: the limited resources to address climate impacts, and then debt burdens that stifle sustainable development. Traditional financial tools such as high-cost loans, short-term financing, and using solutions of austerity measures for financial shocks to deal with physical shocks make the problems worse instead of solving them. And the rigidity of conventional financing, along with conditionalities that don't consider the unique climate challenges of the V20, hinders ability to focus on long-term resilience and adaptation strategies. So it's clearly time to transform the financial system to prioritize climate resilience. So I'll quickly share the Accra to Marrakesh agenda of the V20 finance ministers, and there are 4 points. So one is that it's time to make debt work for climate. Sub-Saharan African countries are at the forefront of the battle against a deepening debt distress and climate vulnerability. Our estimates show that early debt servicing costs from 2022 to 2028 for the region will reach about 80% of annual climate finance needs alone. And worse, the high cost of capital is pushing new financing further out of reach. So this means that while collective progress towards achieving the sustainable goals remains slow and halting, it remains slow and halting at best. And so it's time to reform the debt architecture to support climate vulnerable distressed countries to gain access to debt relief in a predictable, efficient, and timely manner in a way that leverages new funding and resilience. Equally important is credit enhancement that should accompany debt restructuring, and we need guarantees and incentives such as debt service standstills that encourage the participation of all creditor classes for speedy resolution of debt negotiations. Debt restructuring today is a little too late, too unpredictable, and too divorced from development and climate realities. As I know that the IMF is also in the room, critical to this is also to refine the debt sustainability analysis to ensure that it takes into account climate finance needs, and also that we work on making available liquidity options for countries. There may be opportunities for climate contingent swap lines between central banks. Further to the international financial reform agenda, as the moderator mentioned, it's clear that we need to massively scale up multilateral development bank resources. And it's clear that we need to immediately increase external low-cost financing for SDGs and climate action. So there are two arenas of focus for the V20. One is ensuring the financial sustainability of the IMF's various trust funds through enhanced pledges. And two, scaling up towards the tripling of available resources in the World Bank's IDA through donor contributions, IDA bonds, balance sheet optimizations. It's clearly not an impossible task. I'm sure many of you have seen the report and perhaps the article that came out recently that shows that IBRD and IDA could boost lending to nearly $900 billion if rating agencies changed their processes and modified the allowance they make for callable capital. The V20 also continues to advocate for improved access to the IMF Resilience and Sustainability Trust by removing the requirement of concurrent IMF programs to enable countries that need financing easier access. In terms of SDRs in general, the V20 is also calling for the normalization of rechanneling of SDRs to MDBs to facilitate new borrowing up to 4 times the SDR value. Already today, it's clear that MDBs and bilateral partners can work to adapt the entirety of their lending and project portfolios, while also ensuring that no project they undertake today is without adaptation and resilience. Because failing to take into account climate risk today is simply irresponsible. And if we go to the next slide, on carbon financing, the V20 is calling for a new global deal on carbon finance to realize the goals of the Paris Agreement in the near term. So internationally traded mitigation outcomes present an opportunity. This can have new options for countries in terms of having funding streams to contribute to either to sink or to avoid emissions. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that there's an opportunity for 10 gigatons of carbon exchange. And there's also an opportunity for the IMF and other actors to become carbon banks to safeguard macroeconomic stability by recognizing natural capital assets where these internationally traded mitigation outcomes can be credited to debt repayments. On risk management, the global financial system must clearly improve the menu of options to support with finance ministers' risk management options, and also to drive new adaptation and loss and damage resources. Scaling up prearranged and trigger-based funds and finance can improve predictability. However, the architecture we have today is really nowhere near resourced to cover the entire spectrum of loss and damage. We're seeing innovations in parametric instruments and payouts that could be used to address displacement, food security, or instruments that could enhance debt sustainability. But all in all, we need more funds, speedier access, scale, and coordination that doesn't put the burden on the most vulnerable. I also like to take this opportunity to share some perspectives on the just energy transition. Important points include social protection for those who will lose their jobs due to the transition, low cost and long-term financing for renewables to match the phasing down and eventually the phasing out of fossil fuels. Many developing countries across the V20 members are saddled with legacy liabilities from fossil fuel generation. And so it would be important that strategies that are put in place support with countries being able to secure renewable energy technologies while dealing with legacy liabilities. Grid modernization is also a critical component, and the opportunity to participate in transition and critical minerals. And if we go to the next and final slide, the V20 countries are also pursuing climate prosperity plans. And this is specifically to illustrate that by investing in climate, in development positive climate action, they can reach debt sustainability. And so there's an opportunity for MDBs and bilateral partners to support with project preparation and deal team partnerships to realize the aspirations of their climate prosperity plans. We can be working together on catalytical deals that unlock new sources of long-term capital or be crucial in changing market economics towards viability, such as limiting risk, enabling price discovery, and supporting future system design. I think all in all, to conclude, the goal really is not to survive the climate crisis. The landing zone desired for the V20 is prosperity, and that the coalition of 68 climate vulnerable countries whose emissions together are equal or larger than India can contribute to a durable global decarbonization faster and earlier. And with that, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Sarah Jane, thank you so much. I mean, you told us how you like the system, the international financial system to change. We need more money, and that's a key message coming up from the independent expert group of tripling finances. But it's also about the speedier, faster kind of delivery. That's a very kind of important point to stress. Incorporating climate risk in every kind of project. That's a kind of a clear message, and investing in project preparation. So I'm kind of leaving with this kind of 4 points, and you kind of talked about the climate prosperity plan, and it's a kind of a nice actually introduction to talk about the Just Energy Transition Partnership in Senegal. And as I kind of mentioned earlier on, Moussa, you've been working tirelessly on the JETP in your country to support the green transition. And this type of platforms are relatively new, but they can have a transformative impact. And can you tell us a bit more about the objective of the JETP in Senegal, how it works, and more importantly, what role international development partners are playing at the moment?
Well, Lisa, thank you very much. And I will seize the opportunity to just continue on where my colleague just left, and allow me just to set the context for Senegal. So it's going to show how critical this JETP is, and how how critical we really need to have these financing constraints got away. So in Senegal, of course, the country is facing multiple crises, but we do have on top of that 2 specific issues, which is the regional security problem, and also this difficult access to capital market. And in that context, the government of Senegal has committed itself to this just energy transition. The first objective is to kind of improve our energy mix. This is one of our investment focus, because this is going to help us, phase out of this fossil fuel energy production scheme that we have now, but also it's going to be our fair share contribution to lowering the global warming, which is the world target of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So in order to do that, the work that has been done in our collaboration with most of our technical and financial partners, including also the DFIs, the private sectors, and all other financing companies, is to evaluate what are the needs. What are the needs that the financial needs to kind of finance this transition, the transition towards cleaner energy, the partnership, but what also is needed from other donors in terms of technical and in terms of technical assistance to help make this JETP, or just energy transition partnership come alive. In terms of financing, the amount that was identified, our partners that we have for now in terms of pledges, as pledges were made, but what we have seen is that as always, we always have a lot of pledges on goodwill, but the problem is when it's time to tap the pocket, we do not see much of the people, and there is a consequence to the status quo. There's a consequence of no action, and among other actions that we will have to see in this just energy transition partnership is that we may not have energy transition at all, or the energy transition going to be unfair, because the reality is in some developing countries, those countries who contribute the least to the global warming should not be the one who pays the burden of this, of no action or status quo. And the status quo, as I said, will be coming from, you know, pledges that are not fulfilled. And that's one. And the second one is the constraints. You know, the financial, the capital markets is getting more and more constrained. Monetary policy have reached its limits, and we have many constraints on the fiscal policy side. I'm not talking about the daily challenges that we're having with the economy. You know, you need to close your infrastructure gap. You need to invest in education. You need to invest in health. And on top of that, you need to embrace this route of transitioning towards cleaner or greener energy. And not to say that you do not have universal energy in your country. So that is problematic. So you need to finance that, and on top of that, you need to have additional money to, you know, finance this transition towards greener energy. So as I was saying, so you have that constraint. So, and in the JETP you have just, which means the partnership needs to be just. It needs to be fair. And as I said, those who maybe contribute more, those who have higher greenhouse gas emission, maybe should do more efforts in helping those countries who wants, the countries who want not to have a higher greenhouse gas emission, help them invest in greener technology, help them invest in greener infrastructure. And if that is not done, not done in like next 5 to 10 years, but now, because, you know, it's critical. So as I said, there will be no transition at all, or the transition is going to be unfair. So that's the first one. And the second one is you have all these negative externalities that's coming from the global warming that all of us have seen. And this is having dramatic consequences, for example, in countries like, we're foreseeing that, because in countries like Senegal have 750 kilometers of coastal board. And it is one of the most advanced country in the Atlantic Ocean in West Africa. So you can picture the consequences that, you know, this global warming and the changing in this environment is going to have in our country. So you need to be tackling the financing issue for the green energy transition, but also you need to kind of be very creative in finding solution to finance your mitigation and, you know, your the climate, the other climate effects. So of course the development finance institutions has a lot to do. Just recently the IMF developed RST, is one of the tools that the IMF has put together, but this may not be sufficient. And as always, what we have seen with this type of institutions is that everything that we say in ODI stays in ODI.
Let's say,
no, it's a joke. No, this is just a joke. But this is what to say that you all know this joke where we have diagnosis that there was a lot of committees in this ministry, and we need to, you know, streamline the committee. And what they did is set up another committee to try to streamline the number of the committee. So we don't want to fall in that trap, you know, with some other, you know, financing institutions and development partners that, you know, we know where the money is, and we need just to go and tap the money, but not be waiting there. And we cannot wait. We cannot wait anymore. So we know the consequences. We are seeing these consequences coming. So we need to be proactive. Otherwise, we're gonna be the one, you know, facing the consequences, or we may not have the actions or what is needed to face the consequences of this JETP, of this needed energy transition. And the other consequences, is where I'm gonna stop, is if you do not have this financing, either in Ministry of Finances, what you're gonna see is that it's not complicated. You do not have two options. You only have one, and money is not falling from the sky. So either you're gonna reduce your priority spending, as I was mentioning, or you will not be investing in those actions or policies or measures that are needed, to tackle those issues that you are seeing coming, and it's going to have a lot of consequences, including on your macro side, because sometimes that's what we do not see. We are focusing on the climate aspect, but those climate aspect, as the IMF is saying, is becoming macro critical. And if it's macro critical, that means it's going to have they're gonna have consequences on the whole economy. So you're gonna have difficulties on having growth, sustainable growth. You're gonna have consequences with your debt. You're gonna have difficulty, have problems with every other sectors of your economy. So that's why we wanted to set the context, speak a little bit about what needs to be done, and more importantly, the consequences of the no action of the status quo. Just going to stop it there.
Thank you so much. I think we need to recall the urgency of investment and need to kind of act now, even though perhaps the kind of the horizon might be kind of much longer term. We really need to act now. I mean, we heard about the JETP, particularly, there are a number of pledges that are not kind of going through. We heard it kind of loud and clear. And I know also in my experience across the different JETPs, a key feature of these structures is the pooling of concessional finance. We heard it's not enough, and sometimes not enough to attract our other private investors. And we know that concessional finance, it's a kind of a leitmotif throughout this session, is a scarce resource. But we need to expand the pie, and we need more concessional finance. And also we need to make what we have more effective. It feels at times a tall order, especially when the bilateral donors are themselves under tight fiscal pressure. Are we stuck, or do we have solutions to mobilize more concessional finance and allocate it more effectively to address a rising number of challenges and also more severe challenges? A very kind of easy question for you, Kalpana. Can you share some of your thoughts, particularly from your work on climate and development and the white paper? Over to you, Kalpana.
Thank you, Annalisa. Before I do that, though, fun fact: there's all three of your panelists here have some association with the IMF. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But
we all left.
That's true. Anyway, thank you, Annalisa, and thank you, ODI, for the opportunity to speak at this panel. And there's been a lot of discussion about what ministries of finance themselves can do over the last couple of days. So it's good that we're talking about what needs to happen in the global development finance space to relieve what Abe called yesterday the big funding squeeze. And we've been hearing that also from others. I wanted to talk about maybe four things. The first one, I think, is just to put some structure on the whole debate between climate and development. What is the priority, how to fund it, and so on. And we've heard it already in this room just now. The second thing I want to talk about a little bit is on IDA, and again, Sarah, you said something about it, and I'll pick up. The third thing is a little bit about debt restructuring, but I'll leave the bulk of that to Jeremy, because that's what he's going to talk about. And maybe if we have time, I'll say a little bit about what developing countries themselves need to do to bring in the longer term inflows that are needed, right? So first on the dilemma of, we need to spend on all of these things. So it's certainly true what you said, how you started with Larry saying the world is on fire. The thing is, we are no longer at the point where you can think about one development and climate in sequence. We'll do one thing first, and all of this is upon us now. We no longer have the luxury of saying we'll sequence these. They all need to be addressed urgently. And every country in the world, whether you're large, small, advanced, developing, you are now faced with completely reorienting every aspect of economic activity in your, the way everything is conducted. And at the same time, again, whether you're large, small, advanced, or developing, you also have to make sure you're providing for the needs of your population. We're seeing that tension play out right here in this country as we speak. So we need a framework to think about that acknowledges both the need to tackle climate challenges as well as completing the unfinished and actually probably now slightly larger job of poverty reduction and development. So what we did in the ahead of the Paris summit was we tried to put down a framework that says the way to think about this is to really differentiate between countries. Countries have very differing needs, and Sarah, this goes to your the V20 proposal of your platforms or your country prosperity plans, or there's various incarnations of it. But in any case, it's one way to think about it is that there are groups of countries that need different things. What are they? You have low income and possibly low emission countries. You have low and middle income countries that are also high emitters, mine being one of them. You have small island states that have their own problems, and then you have advanced countries that might have the problem of urgently decarbonizing. So, where exactly you draw the line around these matrices is up to discussion, but conceptually you can have these buckets, 4, 5, whatever it is. And then what we said, based on this, we thought that you could think about what types of financing is best suited to deal with these problems. So you're not fighting over the same bucket of financing for everything, right? I mean, so there's a limited amount of concessional resources. I will, in my next breath, I'm going to talk about IDA and how we're going to urge donors to be more generous. But realistically, there's going to be a limited amount of resources. So our thinking was, from just based on economic first principle, where is a concessional money best suited, because no other money is going to go in there, and where can you possibly get private money or other or less concessional money go in. And I think unless you think about it in those terms, A, you're never going to get through the dilemma of what money should go where, and B, you're actually not going to be able to finance anything because finance everything because it just isn't enough money to go around. So that was the framework that we put together in the white paper. It's when I hear myself saying it, it seems blindingly obvious, but it felt like we were making some kind of contribution. We're actually writing something as a follow-up to that to try and dig in a little bit deeper. We hope to have that ready by the time of COP. There's actually some very interesting work that Norway just a paper that NORAD had put out in May of this year that starts to talk about this, an exercise where they talked about what kind of donor funding, their own funding would go for what sources. So it is I think it's being thought about, and more countries need to do that. And actually the World Bank itself needs to do that. The World Bank, I think, one of the points that we need to make to them is that they can't really be everything to everyone, and they can't solve all of the problems in all of the countries, which is a little bit of what the way the bank operates now, and has to be much more selective of what it does in each country. The second point I wanted to make relates to the need for a robust replenishment of IDA. There's the PRGT as well in the IMF, which the trust, I believe, is now fully funded, but a subsidy account is not. But let me just leave that aside for a minute. IDA is unique in its leverage, its concessionality, the breadth, and it really warrants special consideration. Unlike most bilateral aid agencies and other vertical funds, IDA is leveraged, where it can make something like 4 times the amount of money available for every donor dollar. And it is the essential countercyclical financing provider. No other institution really is scaled up to do that. So, it's funded through donor contributions, as we were talking about, Annalisa, a little while ago. The last 4 replenishments, donor contributions have been flat in nominal terms. If you go back a couple of replenishments before that, it's declined in nominal terms. People in this room have used the term shameful a few times, and maybe that applies here as well. We've had on the plus side, I guess we've had the biggest declines, by the way, have been in the G7 countries. Some new donors have come in, China, Saudi, Korea, and stuff, but they haven't been able to really make up for the declines that you've seen before. And then actually there was I have to make a plug for a paper that was written by one of our partners at FDL. But the paper that they wrote points to the debt situation being really costly to IDA, because now it's being forced to switch from loans to grants as more and more countries move into debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. And in fact, a lot of what IDA's loans that are going to these countries are being used to repay other creditors. So it's a really interesting paper if you haven't seen it. So anyway, it's time to call for a very strong replenishment of IDA. We certainly will be taking some of our cues from the work that you all did, Annalisa, in the high level group in G20, but we are calling for an increase of at least 50% in donor contributions in the coming replenishments. And the third point I want to make, as I said briefly, is on the debt situation. I mean, right now, what we have in the sovereign debt restructuring process is unwieldy, time-consuming, and really kind of not working very well. And I know Jeremy will talk about this, but we've told ourselves, and it's certainly true, that we're not a systemic. This is not a systemic debt crisis. But tell that to the countries that are having to make really difficult choices each time every month in many cases. So yes, we're not in a systemic debt crisis, but to me that's a really poor excuse to have a system that just doesn't work. So but Jeremy, you'll say something about that and we can talk about it after. And then the fourth thing I wanted to say was, we haven't talked about what's in the control of developing countries to do, and that is really to put the economic house in order. Governance reform, those don't cost money. Everybody knows what to do, and there is no more sustainable de-risking strategy than putting getting your institutions right. And with numerous examples, including from countries that I worked on a lot in Asia, which 20 years ago would have been very similar to many countries in, say, Africa, and now are in a completely different situation. A lot of it is because they did the hard work of doing the institution building and governance improvement. So I'll stop there. And Annalisa, over to you.
Aparna, thank you so much. I mean, you touch upon the different kind of financing mix, that restructuring, and also would like to kind of make the point around IDA. I mean, IDA is a very effective way for bilateral donors to invest their own resources. I mean, Kalpana mentioned out of every dollar, now we are last replenished won 23 billion of donor contributions. They're being able to leverage 93 billion. And we need to remember this is predictable financing for 3 years and for long-term development. So instead of a kind of $1 in, $1 out, IDA is a really, really kind of good investment. So Jeremy, we talked a lot about concessional finance. It's not a lot, and many countries have been borrowing from international capital markets. But even for countries with market access, the pressure on that service is mounting, and refinancing is becoming more challenging than ever before. And we spoke about, we really need to kind of invest at scale to tackle the most pressing challenges that we have, and with urgency. But many countries cannot afford to borrow more or at a faster pace. So what can be done to give finance ministers a sort of breathing space? Why are that restructuring so difficult to achieve right now? Over to you, Geronimo.
Right. So, of course, the way to think of debt restructuring is as the last resort, rather than breathing space. No finance minister I know likes to restructure. So let me sort of take you through the argument by showing you a few slides. Let me first remind you of how emerging market and developing economies debt restructurings are supposed to work, and then why it's not working as it's supposed to work. So very simply put, the standard template is, a debtor country runs out of money, approaches the IMF. The IMF, if it deems debt to be unsustainable, will not lend unless depending on the debt structure, one or both of these conditions are satisfied. So if the debt that is unsustainable includes a significant share of official bilateral creditors, the fund needs something called credible and specific financing assurances. Financing assurances is a misleading term that it really means debt restructuring assurances. And then with respect to private creditors, the fund needs something rather less onerous, namely merely a thing called a credible process. And that is a pretty low bar. So if a finance minister calls financial advisors, makes an announcement that a debt restructuring will be sought from the private creditors, that's normally enough for the fund to go ahead with lending. So the country does these things. The official creditors provide these credible and specific debt restructuring assurances. And again, at this point, this only means sort of a general understanding that debt will be restructured in line with the IMF or IMF World Bank debt sustainability analysis, and then the IMF lends, right? So that's how it works. And traditionally this hasn't worked so badly, and one of the reasons is because the Paris Club provided a pretty effective forum to coordinate the official creditors. Okay, now what's more difficult now than it used to be? So, I mean, I have to give the title of this conference a nod, but it will only be a nod, then I will move on. So the age of polycrisis does complicate things because it introduces something you might call exceptional uncertainty. And so obviously it's easy for things to go wrong. It's easy for the IMF to get needed debt relief wrong, for the DSAs just to be too little or maybe too much, and then too hard to actually get the debt relief. It's harder for IMF programs to address what is sort of a constitutional requirement for IMF lending, which is to address the so-called medium-term balance of payments problem. So if there are huge real problems out there that are not actually under the control of the debtor country that's coming to the IMF really cannot lend, right? And so that was the situation in Ukraine, for example. And so the IMF tried very hard to sort of adapt its framework to make it more flexible to deal with these situations of exceptional uncertainty. And of course, you can accuse it of hypocrisy, or the main shareholders of hypocrisy, because the IMF did for Ukraine what it would not have done for other countries in a similar situation. But the whole thing had a huge positive spillover because it did it by changing its policies. Now it can benefit others too, under the proviso that this requires enormous degree of shareholder support, right? So the IMF can do extraordinary things if most of its shareholders back it. Okay, but the thing that I want to focus on is the second point, which is changes in creditor structure, which make that hard to restructure. And so there are 2 points here. There is the China and sort of non-Paris Club bilateral creditors that have hugely gained significance. But then the other one, which is sort of slightly less appreciated, is the increasing share of multilaterals. And in some sense, that's even more difficult to address than the China issue. Okay, so this is really the tough nut to crack. So let me show you one chart before I say what one can try to do. So this is just from the World Bank debt statistics from the creditor reporting system, just the total in billions of US dollars of public external debt from low income countries. So it's maybe about 70 countries or so, just the aggregate. And basically what, this starts in 2000, I think. And you just see it getting a lot more colorful, right? And that colorfulness is, in a sense, in a way it's good. I mean, there are more diverse sources of funding, of debt, but exposed when you're trying to restructure it, it's a problem, because you have all these different creditor groups that have different interests, and you need to sort of get them all on board. Of course, not every low-income country has all these creditors, but many have. And the remarkable thing is this yellow area here. This is China. So China surpassed the Paris Club, the entire Paris Club, so all Paris Club members together, as an official creditor in 2015, when its share of total external debt of LICs surpassed about 15%. The Paris Club maybe was 12, 13%. Now, China has actually scaled back its new lending quite a lot. So now, in the last year or so, the Paris Club is again slightly bigger than China. But again, this is the total of the Paris Club. So it's good. They've gone from maybe 15% to about 12%. And then what you also see is sort of this light blue area at the bottom, right? This light blue area at the bottom is the multilateral creditors, including the IMF. And this has also gone up a lot. On average, it's still, in the order of maybe 55%, maybe not too terrible. But then I looked, and last time I looked, there were about 20 low-income countries that actually owe more than 2/3 of their external debt to multilaterals. Now, that's a problem because this debt is in principle unrestructurable. And so if you are going to be insolvent, then, a 30%, 40% haircut in NPV terms is pretty standard. It's kind of average. So that means that if you're not going to touch the multilaterals, you have to write down the entire outstanding debt of the rest. And the others are not going to like that, right? So that really locks these, debt has become very hard to restructure. So what can one do about it? So let me take sort of the China issue and the multilateral creditors separately. So in the case of China, we had sort of a very brave attempt to fix this. And this came out of the pandemic, the debt suspension, service suspension initiative, and the idea to sort of take this spirit of G20 cooperation and apply it to deep debt relief rather than just pushing out some maturities. And so, it was pretty bold. It was very difficult to negotiate. The memo that's out there that you can read, it's a 2-page memo. It's pretty thin. It's full of holes. The holes are deliberate because they reflect just the need to get all the G20 on board. And so, it's been certainly disappointing. You said that, but you cannot say that it was a complete failure, right? So there has been some slow progress. So first of all, very few countries have applied, right? So in that sense, that's already kind of a warning, a red flag. Among the countries that have applied, we have now, after 3 years of trying, gotten somewhere in 2 cases. So 2 cases are done, Chad and Zambia. Now, Chad wasn't very deep. Zambia was the sort of the big one. And that was, I think, quite remarkable what was achieved. And then with Ghana, we got to the financing assurances stage, but not yet, as far as I'm aware, the real thing. Okay, so then the other problem is that, of course, the common framework only covers about 70 low-income countries. It doesn't cover Sri Lanka, it doesn't cover Suriname, it doesn't cover many other countries. And so here there's been some attempt to coordinate outside the common framework, and this is more difficult than inside the common framework, but it can be done. And basically, if cooperation inside the common framework improves, then that probably has some spillovers for coordination outside it. Now, the important thing is, it's really not useful for everyone to bash the common framework, because the common framework is not the problem. The common framework is just a document and a process that tries to address an underlying problem. And that underlying problem is incentives, geopolitics, distrust, right? So it has to do with internal incentives of Chinese lenders. It's not a very restructuring friendly culture there. That has to do with the organization of the Chinese state, with coordination failures inside China, with worries that if you are going to give a lot of debt relief, that means that you made huge mistakes in the first place. No one wants to admit these types of mistakes. And then, but fundamentally, it's also about distrust, not just between the US and China, but essentially China, being now the largest creditor, does not think that it necessarily has to buy into the system that the West has developed to do the restructuring, right? And the essential part that's so difficult for China is this notion that there is a delegated agency, the IMF, or in the case of low-income countries, the IMF and the World Bank jointly, that decide on how much debt relief is needed, that you sort of delegate this momentous decision rather than having control over it and negotiating it at once. No? And this problem was resolved in the memorandum that constitutes the common framework by having this formulation that the debt relief would be granted in line with the IMF DSA, IMF World Bank DSA, and the creditor's collective assessment. This is the magic words that were found, I think, by Guillaume Chabert to solve this problem. And that's been the magic word so far. But it's a game, right? Do we completely delegate to the IMF? No, we really don't. But then we have to, right? And so it requires essentially convincing the Chinese side, case by case, that the deal is not too debtor friendly, right? That's the fundamental point. They are, their foreign policy is debtor friendly. Their financial decisions are not necessarily debtor friendly if they're on the creditor side. Okay. So with what we do about multilateral creditors. So obviously, if this gets bad enough, and so here I'm sort of with a group of current and former IMF people saying it's not yet as bad as it was in the 1990s, just before HIPC. There's still a little bit of room to go, but we are getting there. If it gets bad enough, then of course ultimately the multilateral creditors will have to be restructured, right? And it's going to probably take the form of another MDRI type thing. Now, the difficulty is that for the same reasons why coordination within the common framework is so difficult, pulling off an MDRI is going to be a bloody nightmare. I mean, remember, we were in an exceptionally propitious political situation in advanced countries in the late 90s. This was sort of the triumph of the West, the triumph of globalization, the triumph of Gordon Brown. So this combination between the West feeling very secure and feeling sort of inclined to show some generosity, and of course having to recognize that these countries would never be able to repay, right? It was in some sense the perfect moment to do this. This is not going to come back. So what else can you do? So one obvious thing is keep the number of multilaterals from growing, because that's also a problem. And there are more and more institutions that would like this mantle to be protected. And so here I take a little bit of credit for that. It was part of an IMF paper, the 2022 review of arrears policies, where the objective was to do that. And we got into big trouble with some very big lenders who want to be multilaterals, and we said you're not, right? And I'm not going to speak about that. So it's difficult. It can be done, but you cannot. Of course, the stock is still there. Finally, one thing you can do, right, and that's sort of the pragmatic thing to do, is even if MDBs cannot restructure, you can use grant contributions to quasi restructure. But if you're doing that, you're competing with that precious IDA money, right? You cannot give this new money for new projects, right? You have to do it to effectively pay back yourself. And this is the reason why the World Bank, and particularly the people working on IDA, always hated this idea, because they didn't want their precious IDA round to be sort of subverted for this reason, but it may be the only reason. Okay, just to throw out three more ideas, since this was supposed to be about architecture, of useful architecture reform related to debt restructuring. Obviously, I'm in favor of debt contracts that envisage some sort of automatic debt relief in response to certain events. This is a super old idea. It was there in the 1980s already. It's now come back in the form of climate resilient debt contracts. Still a good idea, and it's a bit more accepted now. To go to Sarah Jane and the V20, in countries with very high climate risks, there is probably scope to condition debt relief on adaptation investment. Why is that a good idea? So rather than the standard macro conditionality on actual adaptation investment, the reason is that because if you have this investment, it makes the debtor more solvent in the future, and then it actually makes sense for the creditors to give bigger debt relief. And then finally, the holy grail, I think, for these very highly indebted countries is for these very high officially indebted countries, is consider non-debt created forms of official development finance. So some sort of equity type instrument, first loss tranches, not guarantees, because those are hard again, right? And the idea is that you basically use official money to suck in more private debt, which is less hard to restructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So we are moving to the kind of Q&A kind of side. I also would like to encourage those online to kind of raise their questions in the online chat. Also, while people are gathering your thoughts, I would like to have another plug-in. I mean, I remember Shakira Mustafa with us, and Chris Humphrey, one of our senior associates, actually reflected on this kind of trade-off at either lend or suspend. I mean, we are in a situation where should the IFIs expand their lending or trying to kind of finance that relief. It's an either and or, and then the question is that what will kind of deliver the kind of greatest impact. So this is a kind of a very lively question on where to prioritize scarce, again, concessional finance. So any questions in the room? Who wants to break the ice? Well, Tom.
This is a question for Jerome, and the point about the low-income countries that owe a lot to the multilaterals. Setting up something like an MDRI Mark II, is this something you would want to see some donors working on now so that it's ready if the crisis hits, so the instrument is there, rather than, you know, it hits, then you wait 5-10 years for the negotiations to happen to be set up? So that's one part. And the second part of the question is, you go through all the reasons why it's difficult. I mean, one advantage is that these are low-income countries. By global standards, they're relatively small economies. You know, we've got the large risks of a Trump presidency or Trump election win next year, and God knows what that would do to any kind of US participation in it, solving any global issues. So given the size of the economies and the problem in kind of monetary terms not being overwhelmingly large, is this something that European donors, would include the UK and the European donors, could come together and try and find a solution to solve themselves? Thank you.
Are there any questions? Because I would love to take a group of 3. Yes, over there.
So this is by far more depressing than yesterday's poly-crisis discussion. So donors are talking big. They were talking big after the Afghanistan rebuilding events and Iraq rebuilding, and they're still talking big about climate financing, and there's very little coming through. Combine that with the picture we've just seen, how difficult it is to restructure and give haircuts, which were, in Argentina's case, precipitous, and a lot has changed since then. Combine that with very bad R-G dynamics, which we haven't spoken about much today or yesterday. So it seems like what is really on the table is self-financing, which is difficult in a low-growth environment, and structural reforms to engender more growth and more revenue for self-financing. Is that a pretty clear synopsis, with the exception of some of the tinkering on the margin for architecture? Yeah, to German in particular, would appreciate your thoughts on that.
Any other questions? If not, can I raise a kind of a question? I mean, Kalpana, you talked about IDA. What should we do to kind of raise the profile of IDA? Are there any kind of directions and instructions for us to contribute to that? So that's my kind of question. Jeremy, shall we talk about MDRI 2? Shall we start now?
So it's always a good idea to prepare, right? The question is whether you do this in secret, in a drawer, right, or more publicly. The problem is, once you raise this, everything stops, right? And first, it is a source of moral hazard, and second, it will probably mean that multilaterals stop lending to a whole bunch of potential MDR participants. Do we really want to do this at this point, right? I think you want to do this when you have a clear sense that it is too late, and then also never forget that, I mean, I'm happy to be contradicted here, but no country really likes debt restructuring. I mean, many African countries have worked incredibly hard to have some form of market access. They're not going to throw this away and go back to the 90s, right? So it's a difficult problem. On EU, UK, yes. I mean, obviously, you know, if we get a much less cooperative US, yes, then we will have to do it on our own, right? But, you know, I've not given up. Hope springs eternal. And of course, there's one area where I think we really need the US on board, and certainly with the present administration that will work, and that is the essentially climate action conditional financial transfers of the JETP type, right? And I mean, here I think that there is a very interesting paper by a group of authors around Patrick Bolton and Alissa Klein-Nijenhuis, which actually also includes Tobias Adrian as an author, that essentially estimates the net welfare benefits from decarbonizing the power sectors, the energy sector, so essentially the welfare approach. And the main point in this paper, which is not brought out very well, but I want to write a policy brief where I point this out, is that it's so large that in some cases the EU and the UK on their own, but certainly the EU, UK, the Americans, and Japan, Canada, Australia, if they can resolve the free riding among themselves by operating together, they would more than get their money's worth by essentially paying for decarbonization in those countries.
Kapana, Oneida.
So, Annalisa, I think the answer is, we have to stay tuned. We're working on it. I think we realize, we had a discussion yesterday actually with our co-chairs on this, but we realize that simply saying you need more, there needs to be, even the fundraising efforts that IDA has done, the bank has done, are generally very lackluster and not very inspiring. So maybe thinking already from that, the whole process, I think, needs to be rethought and not rethought, re-energized, if you wish. But again, eyes wide open. I mean, the politics are just not conducive to big replenishments. We will need, I think some of the work that you all have done, some of the work that some of our other partners have done, CGD and others, will need to marshal all of those arguments and to try and make a strong pitch, starting already from the midterm review in December.
Just to kind of also mention that the IDA 21 replenishment process will start in January. So this is a very kind of timely conversation. Of course, our analysis on how to stretch the envelope and expand it will be there. Also, to a certain extent, I came from Delhi after we finalized the report of the independent expert group, actually, and I came back energized and optimistic about the future of the international financial architecture. So I'm really sorry if I haven't convened this kind of enthusiasm about that. But it's let me just now read a question that came from Perny Herbst. It's a kind of let me read it through instead of kind of summarizing. The magic wand, especially post-COP 2016 proposals, appear to be guarantees, but I'm not convinced that they will be realized as what is being proposed on the box. A lot of this seems to be directed to the MDBs to increase ceilings for country lending. What will be required from debtor countries is not clear. The devil is in the detail. As any of this move to discussion of what the contractual structure will look like? Fragmentation regarding implementation is also a challenge. The potential for a narrative regarding this is best practice to be the mantra was being best practice as not being established. I think this is a kind of a very much around the push on the guarantees. Anyone who wants to pick this up?
I think you should say something about that, particularly because in principle, JETPs provide some sort of framework, no? But I really don't know how it works in practice. Yeah.
Go ahead first, and say by the time Sarah Jane prepares.
Yeah. The thing is, in the JETP framework, you have some of course some guarantees that were given by some of the the countries that are willing to kind of chip in this financing box. But again, we do not have any any framework that's clear. As for example, in the IDA replenishment framework, where everything is clear, etc. This is not the case for the JETP. The JETP is a new initiative. The new initiative, but what we have for now is pledge, but we do not even have. The countries do not agree among themselves on what needs in terms of financing envelope, what needs to be achieved. We do not have a clear agreement, at least for Senegal, and also we do not have agreement on if the financing is there, where that money should go. We do know that it needs to finance the transition toward greener energy, yet you do not have the specifics, you do not have the details. So this process the work is still ongoing on this initiative, on the partnership. but yet we are still facing the same problem that we used to have when it comes to having pledges and then getting the money there when the money is needed.
Because one of my questions would have been, what development partners should do differently? And this is a kind of a clear point around following through kind of commitments. Sarah Jane, over to you.
Yeah, just a comment on guarantees. It's clear that they've been slow, and it's in MDBs, and this is because of a variety of reasons. One is the incentives are not aligned for staff and MDBs to actually bring guarantees to the finish line. So there's a human capacity constraint in the MDBs. The second thing is that guarantees have been slow, and so I see Jeremy's point about having equity-like instruments, as well as stop loss being a lot quicker than guarantees. So it may be that MDBs, as part of their reform, to also upscale their human capacity, human capital, to actually get these to the finish line.
Yes, go ahead.
So my point about equity wasn't so much about speed, but just that in the end, you don't want, indirectly money is owed to multilaterals beyond what is already owed to them, right? So it's essentially, equity is like a form of grants, right? But in a way that leverages private money. But I think that what the question is about is something else, which is, I mean, clearly, if this is going to be the big channel, whether equity, first loss guarantees, doesn't matter. But if the idea is some sort of public subsidy, right, that leverages private money, we have to be very careful what we're going to subsidize, right? And so I don't think there is a very strong framework out there yet. So what is the problem? So, the problem could be some macro issues in that country where in principle with the RST, something like that, you can handle that, right? But beyond that, it's going to be like, project selection. After all, this is supposed to be subsidizing private investment. So, Frédéric is there nodding, and we worked at EBRD. So I imagine this would work a little bit like an SME credit line or something like that, right? So you have a local bank or you have a local development bank that is charged with your actual project selection, and then you have the MDB give some sort of credit line that is subsidized to that local bank, and then you need to build capacity to select the right process. And of course, so that's going to make it even longer, right, Sarah Jane, because it's not just about structuring this within the MDBs, but I think you need to create some sort of local institutional capacity to actually spend this money well. And I don't even know whether anyone has started doing that. I mean, I don't know much about MDBs.
Samantha Attridge might have some kind of answers to that. Sam, over to you.
Just on that very last point, there's a very good example, and that's PTSMI in Indonesia, which is a local development bank, and talking about kind of the JETPs. It has actually, I think it's about a 3.2 billion blended fund, the first thing is actually, it implies a very different way of working of MDBs and DFIs, actually giving up control and pooling the concessional finance at the country level. And this is what's happening in Indonesia, and it's managed by PTSMI. It's about a 3.2 billion SDG fund, and they also have a clean transmission mechanism to retire coal earlier. So it's a very capable institution, a development bank, which is highly integrated in country plans and vision. So ownership and this idea, if you like, kind of about the vision, what's the pipeline, what's needed to be financed, what can government do, how can they bring in the private sector, and then a bank which has the capacity kind of to do this. And as I say, it requires a very different way, I think, of MDBs and DFIs and how they engage to mobilize the private sector, which traditionally has been a kind of a ad hoc transactional scouting around for the odd kind of project, and kind of giving it to the ownership of the country and its vision plan and its institutions to be able to deploy that capital. And the problem with the JETPs that I understand so far with the pledges is that so much is this pledge, and actually a lot of it, they're thinking we're going to catalyze private money here, but there's no plan or vision on how that's going to be done. And the intricacies of that are quite complicated, but a good example, and I've done some work on it, PTSMI, great example to have a look at how this is being done. But you need a very capable government and institution to do it.
Thank you, Sam, for giving us a kind of a positive example. Kahal, over to you. And then I have a question from the online audience.
I guess it's from Musa, but others can chime in as well. I'm kind of new to the JETP thing. I'm not as up to date with it, as my other colleagues. But I guess I might have some concerns that it's using up a country's human capabilities, in particular within government, and struggling to get off the ground, and that those government assets might be better deployed towards what we were talking about in the previous session with Andres Velasco, a growth strategy. Or maybe I'm just don't know enough about it, and they're actually the same thing. JETPs are like the new growth strategy for this era. So yeah, interested to get your thoughts on that.
Can we just, this is quite a key point. Musa, would you like to reply directly?
Yeah, I mean, it can be seen that way, but you may also you may not take it as, you know, as a clear new growth strategy, as it I mean a proper growth strategy. It's a part of, you know, policy actions that, for example, again for the case of Senegal, we were already working on, you know, improving our energy mix, for example, because as you may know, in 2024, Senegal is becoming an energy producing country with oil and gas. So we had a whole what we call a gas to power strategy, which is moving from fossil fuel use to produce electricity to gas. So, and you know, the commitments that we had in this JETP, among others, are to clean up our process of producing electricity, for example. So it's not a whole, you know, new growth trajectory, but it's among other policies that was undertaken, and then it's just been, you know, embedded in this JETP, and then, you know, it has this benefit of, you know, contributing positively to the global warming emissions, which is the objective of, you know, the JETP.
Thank you, Musa. Can I check with the Master of Ceremonies if I can take 5 more minutes, as we started 5 minutes later? Yes, thank you. So I have a question at the back, please.
Thank you so much. My question relates to the fiscal rules and the questions raised by you about energy transition and fiscal transition. There is a co-movement. So how we can tackle this and make the finance ministry ready to tackle this challenge? Because fiscal transition and energy transition are just moving together. One idea from Government of India, they have incorporated you know, the energy transition, the power sector reforms as a part of the fiscal consolidation by linking a part of the extra borrowing space to power sector reforms. So that's one way, you know, the Government of India tried. But what are the other ways in which we can try? Because Central Bank is not in a mood to get into this because they don't have tools. So there is a reputation risk. But Bank of England and ECB, they are leading the way, but Government of India and our central bank, they're a little shaky about it, how they can enter into it. So when monetary policy is limited in its scope to integrate these concerns, how can the finance ministry be ready to do this? And also talk about the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. In India, we have the Finance Commission coming up in November. So we may incorporate a criteria in the tax devolution formula we already have, but we may give a more weightage to the climate concerns. And in November, in Dubai, there will be articulation of the National Adaptation Communication. So how can the finance ministries be prepared incorporating these challenges? So it's to the panelists.
It's a very tough question. Anyone who wants to, Kalpana, can see.
I'm not sure I fully follow the question, actually. So so the question is, as say, let's say India is making its transition to clean energy, what role can the finance ministry play? Is that what you're asking?
And how it can be integrated in the fiscal rules framework and the fiscal consolidation.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, why didn't you? Sorry, or maybe so.
These two is linked from my perspective, from my understanding from the Minister of Finance. These two are linked. For example, in the energy transition, if you take aside the climate aspect of it, at the end it's supposed to reduce the cost of energy. And by saying cost of energy at the Minister of Finance, we're talking about subsidies. And if you're reducing subsidies, you're getting your fiscal policy more sound. And then that's the way. That's how these two terms, from my perspective, from the perspective of the Minister of Finance, are completely linked. At least in the medium term. In the short term, it can go the other way around, because you're going to need more money to invest to have cleaner energy, and that can have an impact on your fiscal path, fiscal consolidation. But toward the medium or long term, definitely you're gonna have a reduction in your costs of energy, and that's gonna help your fiscal consolidation plan. It's a long term. You all Ned.
I wanted to check if Sarah Jane wants to come in on this question.
No, thank you.
Shall I do? I have one more question from the online audience, and I have Frederic. Are there any other, and Rebecca, anyone else? Okay, so I'll do the one online because it's very close, and then Frederic and Rebecca. So this question comes from Sherilyn Raga. She's a research fellow here at ODI, I think very close to my previous experience. So is it a time to rethink about the relevance of the debt sustainability analysis and the role in unlocking finance during multiple crises? Debt sustainability is heavily anchored on fiscal adjustment, which have higher contractionary effects during shocks. Should the debt sustainability analysis also start to reflect alternative growth paths through a policy mix, for example, protecting investment while consolidating, that can support growth and should give more confidence to international financing institutions to extend financing? Jeremy, probably that's for you. Thanks.
Yeah, so in principle, DSAs are supposed to be forward-looking and take into account, long-term growth effects, prevented output costs from natural disasters, and so forth. And for low-income countries, it's a 20-year horizon. For market access countries at the fund, there's normally a 10-year horizon, but it can be longer. So I think that if these things are the current framework essentially allows you to capture these effects. And one thing that we did at the fund just before I left was to essentially commit fund teams to reflect costs of climate adaptation in DSAs. And we actually made this compulsory in debt restructuring cases. So the idea that climate effects should be reflected in DSAs, I think that message has been understood and in principle implemented in the methodology.
Thank you, Jeremy. Before going to Frederic and Rebecca, let me just kind of read a remark from Hannah Ryder, who is the CEO of Development Reimagined. And this speaks to the kind of debt restructuring points. The idea that China and other creditors need to be together to negotiate with each borrower, Hannah says, is a red herring. An often unknown fact is that in Paris Club negotiations, borrowers are not even in the room for the final discussion. After representation of their case, the borrower exits, and the French representative conducts a shuttle diplomacy to inform the borrower of the outcome. Totally new arrangements are needed. Borrowers should and can coordinate and negotiate with creditors one by one. So also Anna and her team has written quite a lot on the kind of borrowers club. So I would also encourage you to look at this. Frederic, over to you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a question actually to Jerome, but perhaps you want also to chip in. We didn't talk at all about private creditors as part of the architecture. And I wonder whether it's because especially for countries that just access market as part of this round of funding, it's now deemed to be a mistake and it will all go back to official lending, ideally concessional, or does private sector actually have a role to play going forward? Because also I'm struck that they priced the risk. So that outcome would not have come as a surprise to them.
Your question is actually for everyone on the panel. Who wants to take it? Sarah Jane as well. Jeremy, go.
I can go first. So I did not talk much about private creditors because my talk was about debt restructuring. And in the debt restructuring context, you know, privately held debt is not that hard to restructure. And I know this sounds a bit flippant. It's just not sort of the binding constraint. Right now, we pretty much know how to restructure bonds. Of course, there are difficult situations, right? So in Suriname, for example, you know, it was very difficult because they had this oil exploration ongoing. And so basically the bondholders were arguing, you're rich, you don't need anything. And the Senegalese would be say, this is pie in the sky. So you get difficult situations. No, but if a country has a credible threat that it's going to not pay, and this is and it is supported by official institutions, the private sector normally restructures. It's true even, at least in the case of publicly traded firms like Glencore that had secured debts, right? So we were incredibly worried. It was very difficult. In Chad, Glencore had a super strong form of collateralization. And yet, ultimately, after a lot of foot dragging, they collaborated just because it was a reputational issue to them.
Yeah, in the case of Senegal, for example, managing private debt, as Jeremy is saying, is quite different, and probably it's easier for at least for governments. Senegal, we did not participate to the common framework, and even by not participating in the common framework, we specified that we should not talk about private debt because governments probably know how to deal with private debt. And in this financing need, of course, we're gonna need private money, but again, on that aspect, their logic, their thinking, their decision-making process for any project, any investment is quite different from the multilateral development banks or from the IFIs. So that's probably why the issue, for example, for Senegal to tapping private money, we have elaborated a whole this new ESG framework that we are going to be using in order to promote climate-friendly project, etc. And we do not have much issues on that, but it's more on the other side.
Thank you, Moussa. Rebecca, over to you. Mike, over here.
Thank you. And I should just preface, I'm not an expert on this at all, so apologies if I've misunderstood how some of the mechanisms are expected to work. But it just sounds to me like there's really a lot of hope hanging on this idea that we can leverage more private financing into low-income countries for investment, particularly. And I'm just wondering whether or not it's a little bit two sides of the same coin, that some of the reasons private financing isn't flowing or the risk premiums attached are going to be increasing if the country's in debt distress or suffers from high debt overhang, that the risks associated are very much linked to sort of problems with exchange rate unpredictability or risks that the government's not investing in the sort of supplementary infrastructures that's needed to make sure that your investments are going to have a return. So is there an extent to which this idea of sort of guarantees is still kind of just the sort of flip side of the same, the sort of getting to ultimately handled by the same problems, and are there not sort of fungibility concerns there too?
I'm not taking advantage of my role as moderator to answer, Rebecca. I wanted to check if Sarah Jane wanted to come in, or if not, Jeremy, over to you.
So this goes back to something that Kalpana said at the beginning, that there are countries in vastly different settings, and I think we sort of we created the sort of a conflation thing at the end. So when I was talking about I think when we were talking about guarantees just now, right? What we mean is guarantees or other forms of loss of risk transfer for the purpose of large-scale climate finance. And the borrowers here are emerging markets. They are solvent emerging markets, not overly indebted countries, right? We're talking about India, we're talking about Indonesia, right? And so these are instances where the jump, the reduction in the cost of capital that you have to do to make this investment profitable is relatively small, right? But then I do agree that I sort of may have created the impression that, you know, maybe this is a solution for a much broader set of countries with deep solvency issues. I agree with you that there, you know, the important thing is the fundamentals that you also need to fix. So I assume that there will be some retrenchment from private capital sources in frontier economies. That is pretty much unavoidable, and this retrenchment probably cannot be overcome by MDB type guarantees or first loss, unless it is for very specific purposes, right? Where the project risks are controllable and well selected, and maybe in the context of RSTs or sort of other frameworks that also reduce macroeconomic risk, right? So maybe you can combine it, you know, JET-P type things.
Fantastic. I think our time is up, and please do join me in kind of thanking Sarah Jane, Kalpana, Jeremy, and Mousse for an incredibly kind of rich discussion, far-ranging from JET-P, debt, and concessional finance, and the perspective of V20 countries. And particularly, a big thank you to Sarah Jane, who is in Manila, and I kind of lost count of what time of the night might be. So please join me in thanking them.
Thank you.